Hey guys and girls, thank you for joining me again today. We've got a lot to discuss this weekend. I've actually had a lot going on personally with Nikon and my accessories, so I have lots to talk. Initially I would like to discuss with you 50mm lenses and also the 85mm focal length. So we're going to discuss those, the various apertures, everything from f1.2, which is the lens I owned last year, and then what we're going to look about is the f1.4, 1.8, 2.8, so on, and we're going to discuss all the applications and the advantages of either size and file. Now I've got a lot of video information, a lot of photo samples to show you, and I will talk you through that. And I think you'll find it very interesting, and some of it actually very surprising. I was actually impressed and surprised myself when we started to cross-examine files and the f-stops and compare the out-of-focus backgrounds, and it was quite informative. So I hope you'll stick with me and follow through the videos. So there will be two 12-minute videos. One will be discussing the bokeh of the different lenses and their different apertures, and the other one will be discussing sharpness, and I think you'll find that very interesting. And then the third segment is all about photo editing. So we're going to have a look a little bit at Lightroom and how we can make something like a 1.8 factor look something more like a 1.4, 1.2 with a few simple steps in Lightroom, and you'll think you'll really benefit from that. If you haven't already seen it and discovered how to do it, I'm going to walk you through it very quickly, and you'll find that it'll be an amazing tool and help you out with the nice useful skills and tools that Lightroom are providing. And we'll walk through that in a moment. But initially, let's talk about 50mm. Now, I have a recent acquisition. This recent acquisition is this here, which is the 50mm S-line lens, 50mm 1.8. Now, this is a lens I've owned before. I've owned this about 2 years ago when it first came out, and it was a brilliant lens. But then later on, about a year later, when I got the 51.2, then that obviously superseded this one, and I didn't need two primes around a similar focal length, so I've decided that I would lose this one. I sold it, and then I bought some other lenses to try out. That's something I do. I'm always buying and selling lenses all the time, so that's why almost every video I've got a new lens or camera or some accessory to talk about. It's because I'm always swapping and changing, and that's how you learn, don't you? It's creative, and you can always buy them back later, and that's exactly what I've done with this one. So why would I reacquire this 50mm 1.8? Well, I'll explain exactly why. See, I had two other lenses with me, two Sigma lenses, that I wasn't using anywhere near as much as I would have liked. Now, they were great lenses. They were the Sigma Art 24mm 1.4 and the Sigma Art 35 1.4mm. And they were brilliant lenses, make no mistake. They were sharp, they rendered the image fantastic. In my theory, in my idea, I was going to use them a lot for video, and I thought they would be great to have around. But what had happened is I just noticed over the course of 12 months that I barely got them out of the bag or barely took them with me because I just didn't have the application that often. I had various zooms, and for example, like this recent acquisition of the little 28mm 2.8, this is so compact and light to throw that around with you, and it's exactly in between 24 and 35, isn't it? So a 2.8 aperture, I found that fine for a wide angle lens, that when I need one, it's reasonably bright, the filters are cheap, I can chuck it in the bag, barely know it's there, and I found that that one was the one I actually reached for and used the most often. And because it was a native Z-mount lens, it is the little compact pancake, but it is also the Z-mount configuration, which means it would just go straight onto the camera, and it was no fussing around with adapters. So I thought, look, that was just the simplest solution for a wide angle when I need it. So I got rid of those other two. I sold them on eBay, and I'd paid about $550 each for them, and when I sold them for about $550. So they didn't really lose anything. It was just a trade and transaction again. And with the money from that, I purchased this lens here, which I got for about $750 on eBay. Now, I normally knew, I think they're around $1,000 Australian, so getting it for $750 and having it with the box almost brand new. I think the gentleman used it, he said, twice, and then he went and bought a 24 to 70 2.8, and then he says he never took it out again. And it's sort of like my scenario. Some things you just, even though they look great on paper and they're actually a good product, it doesn't mean you're actually going to pull them out of the bag and use them. You might have a personal preference, or your circumstances and your style of photography lends itself more to a different focal length and arrangement, like his did to a zoom, and therefore he decided the zoom was the go for him. Now, I've owned that 24 to 70, and I don't mind telling you, that's an excellent lens. Just a bit heavy and clunky for me just to have in the bag in case. But at the same time, it was a good lens, and so good on him. And for me, that means I got a bargain. I got this lens that I'm really going to utilize a lot now. Now, why would I have this if, for example, I already have here the Sigma f1.4 art lens? Now, this is actually a beautiful 50mm and very sharp and extremely high quality lens. So if I have this already with me, why am I having this one? Well, I think you can see straight up when you see them side by side, there is a definite reason, and that is it's a lot more compact. It's a lot smaller and a lot lighter. This is only 400 grams, 410 grams, and this one here is about 700 grams. Now that makes quite a bit of difference in the bag, because you have to use the adapter as well. It ends up almost twice the weight, and then of course it's a lot bulkier and heavier in the bag. So I just found that even though this one is excellent for portraits, and I'm going to keep it and still use it for portraits, because 50mm, that's a focal length I do use quite often. It's worth having one, it's worth even having two. So this one renders so beautifully a portrait, as you'll see later in those videos, tutorials I'll put up in just a minute. It renders so well, I'm going to keep that for the portrait application, and then this one here will be predominantly for my videos. So right now I'm videoing at 50mm, believe it or not, on my Z6. Now I'm using a 24-70 f4 and it's set at f4 right now. But when I finish this illustration, and I've shown you enough through the 50mm I bought, I'll be using that in the video camera, because being a native Z-mount lens, of course it's going to be nice and bright, clean, sharp, and nice image rendering, and also the autofocus gets a good chance of keeping up. Whereas if I were to use some adapted lens like this, for example, well, it may not operate quite as well with the autofocus, even though it'll be a nice sharp image. So this way I'm confident the image will be really good for video. It's nice and light in the bag, and of course it's something you would pull out and use quite frequently. I also have these two very light lenses specifically for when I'm traveling. So if I'm going on holidays or a vacation or just touring around, going for a drive in coffee shops, and you might pull over and want to take some photos of something locally, some scenery, it's nice to have these nice light little lenses with you that are very functional. You can have these in a camera bag with a Z6, doesn't take up a lot of weight, and it's very easy to put them on, take a nice shot, and you're comfortable. It's not burdensome or heavy. So it's like horses for courses. Everything has its advantage, its plan, its purpose, and I found this new little 50mm I bought very useful for me, particularly for video and travel. So what we're going to do is I'm going to run you through, now I've explained why I've bought the lens in the first place, I'm going to run you through these various lenses. Now predominantly we're going to have a look at these three here in the next tutorial. And the idea of that one, this little 12-minute video, it illustrates how the comparative rendering is between f1.8, f1.4, and we're going to use a bit of pretending and imagination here. We're going to call this one the 51.2. Now it isn't because I sold it, but I still have all the images I kept from last year that I'll use in this video. So because this is almost exactly the same size and weight, this is an 85 1.4 with the adapter on it. But size, weight, volume, girth, it's almost identical to the 51.2. So for illustration purposes, I'll be using this in the video when you see them all together. But it's also a very interesting tool to use in comparison, because it's nice to know what is the difference in the rendering between a 51.2 and an 85 1.4. Or what is the difference really between the 51.8 and the 51.4? Is there a significant difference? And so that's the sort of thing you're going to see. So I'll be illustrating that for you at length in that little video. That gives me a little break for a moment. So I'll let you watch that one, and then we'll get back to it and we'll talk a bit more about other issues. Thank you. So hello team, hello friends. We're just having a look at some images now, and we're comparing focal lengths, f-factors, and various softenings of the background, and just how things compare. Now principally we've been talking a lot about a 50mm lens, whether it be a 1.8, a 1.4, and an f1.2. I have some sample images of all these sort of focal lengths, and I can compare them for you. So what I've done is I've done already pre-shots and examples with writing on them, explaining what they are and what the f-stops are. And when you see them compared, it's actually very entertaining. Now what we can do is start off with this example here, and the first one here is the 50mm f1.2 I owned last year, and I compared that with the 85mm. And when you compare it, the 51.2 was 1.8 on an 85, and then I compare here now the 85 1.4 with the 51.2 at 1.2, and you'll see the comparative photos and how the bokeh and the rendition is. So let's start off with this first unit here. Here it's very interesting. The first thing you're going to notice is you have a look at the information here on the side panels, these two side panels, you'll see that this image here on the left is at f1.2. So it's the 50mm Nikon lens at f1.2. And at that arrangement you'll see the background blur and the bokeh here. Now it's a very shallow depth of field. You're only getting a razor thin image of the robot that I have in my backyard, but this is just JPEG files that have not been edited and messed with in any way, straight out of the camera. So it's a very fair comparison and examination. Obviously with 50mm, I've had to come in closer in order to fill the frame. With the 85mm, I could come back a little, but I've made the framing as close and as good to each other as I can. With the 85, you'll notice that it compresses the background more, so there's less actual background in there. With the 50, it's a little bit broader, it just reaches out more, and you'll see a little bit more background. But anyway, we're having a look at the bokeh here. This is what we're particularly interested in. And in this illustration here, you can see you've got beautiful bokeh balls. It's quite creamy and soft and bright, and it's a very pleasant background. You can see the horizon line here. It's actually the end of my billiard table, where I have the robot sitting on. On this one here, it's the exactly same position, same circumstance. You can see the edge, the rim of the billiard table here. I have a cover over it to protect it. And then you can see the bokeh in the background. Now what you'll notice, what I find very interesting about this, is this here, this 85mm lens, the Sigma at 1.8. When you have a look at this information here, you'll see that it's shot at 1.8. And yet, the background bokeh looks actually softer than the 50 at 1.2. So what I'm encouraging people here is to understand it's not all about the F factor, it's not all about the aperture. It's also about your focal length and your proximity. So here, with an 85 1.8, I can actually get as good, if not better, background bokeh than I can with a 50 f1.2, simply because of the focal length, helping me out with compression in the background. So that's a beautiful illustration here, the two together. You've got all the information there, I don't need to tell you too much, but you can see here the difference in the background image. The actual sharpness of each of these images is almost identical, because this is a 1.4 lens, it's stopped down to 1.8 to try and match the background as best I could, and that of course helps sharpen up the image, so it's every bit as sharp as each other. We'll move on now to the next image and we'll compare those two, again of my little robot friend, and here you see the 85 1.4. So the 85 1.4 at 1.4, and here if we go over the other side, you've got the 50 at f1.2. When you compare those two images, what do you see? Well, you'll notice here again, the background on the 85 at 1.4 is remarkably softer and milkier bokeh than the 51.2. So again, the framing is exactly the same, just one camera is a little bit closer or further from the other to get the composition the same. But in real life scenario, that's what you have to do with different focal lengths. But you can see here the f1.2 lens, even though vastly more expensive and of a greater technology and f-stop, doesn't have a better background than the 85 1.4. 1.2 you spend $3,000 on to get this image. Here I'm spending $650 and I'm actually getting a better image in my opinion. So that was just an interesting demonstration of focal lengths and how they render, rather than what we think is actually going on. If we move on to the next image here we see, and if we go to the image information center, you'll see that we're using the 50 at 1.2 at 1.2. So if we progress on to the next image, that's how the background looks and it's how it renders. It's very silky, a nice and soft focus. But when we go on to the next image, which here as you can see is the 1.4 image, you'll notice that it's a little bit darker and not quite as soft, but the difference between that at 1.2 and this at 1.4 is very marginal. There's very little difference. And when I'm using my Sigma 50mm at 1.4, again, that's costing me $600, that lens. When I use the 50 1.2, that's costing me $3,000. So you've got to ask yourself, is that difference, that minor difference, really worth about $2,500? I find it hard to believe. This is the image again, and now we're at 1.8, 50 1.8, and you can see how dramatically darker it is. Now really what we're really noticing, apart from the background blur not being as soft, the image is actually getting darker very quickly. If we move on now and compare that exact same situation, lens, it's the same lens, and you compare it now to 2.8, look how that looks like night. It's so dark at 2.8, and again if we move on to f4, it's really, really dark. I mean, that's an unusable image really. You really got to do a lot of editing to try and bring that back. But when we scoot back to the same lighting situation, the same room and the same composition, and we go back all the way to f1.2, you can see how hugely brighter it is. And I think that's really the relevance of the lens, is when you're in a low light situation, regardless of what background blur you get a beautifully bright and clean image, and that's really handy. So I just thought you'd like to see those. I'll go through them one more time very soft. There's 1.4, and the 50 1.2. It's the 50 1.2 again, but at 1.8. Here it is at f2.8, and there again it is at f4, dramatically darker. Now we're moving on to the 85mm lens, and I'm now rendering that at 1.4, which is wide open for that lens. Now this is the Sigma lens. So it's a Sigma 85, 1.4 at 1.4. Have a look at that bokeh, how beautifully soft that is. That is fantastic look, and a nice bright image as well. Here it is at 1.8, and you can see here the background is just getting a little bit harsher. So there it is at 1.4 again. Here it is at 1.8. You can see it's harshened up a little bit, but still very usable image. It's not exactly ugly, it's just that it's a little bit harder. And here we are at 2.8, and now you're really starting to pick out the background, and you're noticing the bokeh and the softness is nowhere there, and it's getting a bit darker as an image. So I just thought I'd run you through these images and how they look. You're welcome to go back and forth and view them as many times as you like, and you can see here that the sharpness is never an issue. Pretty much any modern lens is extremely sharp and gives a beautiful crisp image. It's rare to find a lens that I'm not happy with brand new regardless of its price. But certainly the background rendering is what I'm interested in today, and that's what I wanted to compare for you. So thank you for your patience with that. So welcome back, guys. I hope you enjoyed that little video run through of all the things bokeh in the world. So I thought the images were very interesting, and I found them very enlightening. The next little segment we're going to talk about now is the actual image rendering, the sharpness. So it's all very well to have a nice soft background, but if the object in question itself is soft, well, that's no good for anyone, is it? So you want to make sure that whatever lens you use, whatever aperture you use, you can compare and see how sharp they are. Now some people will use test charts to try and show you this, but I don't like test charts because I find they're a one-dimensional image. It's much nicer to see something three-dimensional in the photo. You can see the fall off gradually, and you get to see the background blur in contrast with the sharpness and focus of the subject. So that's what I'll be showing you next. Now I'll be using not my friendly robot, but this time we'll be looking at bottles. So there'll be bottles of liquor, and these bottles were taken outside on the pool table as previous photos were, and you'll see through these bottles, you'll see the transparency, the colour, the pop, the clarity, and what we'll be talking about predominantly now is the sharpness, which is extremely relevant. I mean, it is very important to have a sharp image if you're going to take a photo, regardless of how the foreground or background look. But I will reiterate something that I think is very important to be said, and that is that all new lenses are sharp at some aperture, whether it be the widest aperture or one stop down. So sharpness in an image is really not something we need to fuss about. You don't need to really pixel peep at 200% to see if something is sharp, because it's just going to be sharp. It's not the lens's fault if the image isn't sharp. 90% it's, you know, if you haven't got it in focus, you've had motion blur or movement in either the image was moved, the subject was moving, or you were, and or, very importantly, the lighting was terrible. So if you've got bad lighting, it's a dark image, it's grainy because of that, that's not the lens's fault. That's not the aperture's fault, that's your fault for not providing the right lighting. I mean, that's why they sell LED panels and they sell speed lights, so you can always have good lighting. So if you're finding you've got consistently lacking in sharp photos that are a bit grainy and blurry, I'm going to encourage you to look at your lighting rather than worry too much about your lens aperture. But anyway, let's have a look at this next video. It'll explain everything in detail. You'll see the close-ups, you'll see the overall images and comparing them in different apertures and focal lengths. I'm sure you'll find that very interesting too. So while we're talking about different objects and images, I'm just going to take you outside again to the pool table and the veranda, and we're going to have a look at some bottles now for image test comparison. So it's a different sort of an image. Same sort of theme and idea, but you get to see here the sharpness. So we're focusing a little bit on the bokeh, but now we're actually looking at the image quality of each lens and how they render. Now in the top corner here, you may just be able to make out, it's very small print, I'm sorry, but it says here 50mm f1.8 S lens. So this is a 50 1.8, it's not the 50 f1.2, sorry, this is now the 50 1.8, my recent acquisition, and you can see how it renders here. You can see the sharpness, which is magnificent. You can also see here the bokeh impression. Now if we move over now to the 50mm Sigma lens at 1.4, at 1.4 you can see it's a bit softer in the bokeh. So again, this is the Sigma lens over on this side, on the right, and the Nikon 50 1.8S on the left. They're both beautiful images, very sharp and high quality. But that's showing you the difference now between f1.4 and f1.8. It's a slight difference in the bokeh, but it is ever present. Let's move on to the next image. And here we have an interesting example here, where we have the 50mm Sigma lens at 1.4, but now it's rendered at 1.8. So that's the interesting thing. It's a 1.4 lens. I've stopped it down to f1.8, so it's an equal and fair comparison. So here on the left side, we have the 50mm 1.8S lens, wide open at 1.8. That's its rendering at 1.8, and it's crisp and sharp and very beautiful. Very nice image. And look at the background bokeh is nice and soft. But what I will point out to you that I thought was very interesting is the Sigma Art lens has a background rendering that is that little bit softer. If you compare the bokeh here, the white little beads here, you'll see that these are a little bit more onion shaped or a bit more football shaped, and they're smaller. At 1.8, sorry, they're both at 1.8, the rendering here is a little bit bigger and softer. You'll notice it here in between the two bottles. The bokeh is a little bit softer on the Sigma lens than it is on the Nikon 50mm 1.8S lens, both at 1.8. Now why would that be? It's because the art lens is designed for its bokeh and for a bigger glass and for better background rendering. So even at 1.8 it's still going to give you a little bit better bokeh, but it's only marginal. It's not going to destroy the image. We're not talking about it's a deal breaker, but it just is present, and I wanted to bring it out to show you that little point. So when I do portraits, I'm doing portraits of individuals on their own, I'm definitely using the 1.4 Sigma, because even at 1.8 it still gives a better background rendering. But the image sharpness and clarity and overall presentation of the image is beautiful on both lenses at 1.8. It still looks fantastic. Now if we move over to the next image here, we see a super close-up. So that was one of those bottles there of, it was actually on the corner of the image, it was the third bottle in. And here we have this nice whiskey, and you can see the printing here is very sharp and clean. So the 50-1.8 here, the Sigma 50-1.4, but stopped down to 1.8 is here, so they're both at 1.8. And what you're noticing about the images, I find, when you're looking at very intensely close, and particularly I'm noticing here in the face of this gentleman here, I'm noticing that there's just that tiny bit more contrast and detail. It's very marginal. In fact, you have to look extremely hard at the type and print to notice any real difference in clarity or contrast. A little bit more contrast on the Nikon, but that's about the only difference. The background rendering is, I think, better on the Sigma 50-1.4, but definitely the in-camera resolution and clarity and contrast is better with the Nikon. But it's extremely marginal. Have a look here. We're at nearly 150% zooming up before you notice any tiny difference. So there is not a lot in it. And this is why I speak so highly about the value of the Sigma lenses. It's not that they're better. It's just that the value for money is really high. So I just wanted to show you those images. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you for your patience with me showing you those. I hope you benefited in some way and it may have resolved some issues in the mind, clarifying details. So hello good friends, thank you very much for joining me. I've got a picture here of Carla up there. She's quite gorgeous, of course. She's in the back garden in the veggie patch, and it's quite an interesting photo. The photo's an 85mm, as you can see where my cursor is in the histogram up here. It's an 85mm lens. It was shot at 2.2 at this time, and the reason for this is I wanted as much of her in focus as possible and still have a reasonably soft background. For illustration purposes, what we're going to be discussing in this little module here is how we can use Lightroom in order to take advantage of softening the background with their apps. And that way it enables us to have a look as if we had a much wider aperture lens. So rather than spending an extra $3,000 on a 85-1.2, maybe if we've already got an 85-1.8, we can actually get the image to look like it was 1.4 or 1.2. So we don't go too far. You push the boundaries too far, it looks very artificial and synthetic, and we don't want to go there. But we can still benefit ourselves with the software to soften background and maybe even sharpen the subject if you wanted to do that. And that can save you a great deal of money. So I think that the 1.8 lenses are very effective, sharp, and they give a great result. They don't have quite the punch and the effects that a 1.2 has that soften the background, but we can do this artificially in post here in Lightroom, and I think I'm just going to run you through it very quickly. I'm not going to be an exhaustive illustration, just very brief used two photos, one of Carla, one of a kookaburra, to illustrate how we can do this. So to soften the background, what we start with is we've got the photo obviously there and uploaded, and what we're going to do is not worry about our little sliders at the moment, but we're going to pick up the top here in our effects little bar, and in this effect bar, and of course we're in the now develop module. So you click your develop module, and then of course these options come up, and right at the top under your histogram here will be the circle. Now you've got obviously cropping tool, you've got a healing tool, you've got red eye removal, but what we're interested in right now is this masking tool, and it's a little circle. So if we click on that, it brings up several options for you. You can choose the subject, and then you can now, with AI, brighten, darken, sharpen your subject. You can go for the sky, should you have any sky in the photo, which we don't this time. And then you can, of course, adjust the sky, maybe get rid of some highlights and overexposure. And then you've got the background option, which is what we're going to be hitting with today. So we're looking at this area here. If you follow my cursor, you should be able to see that we've got here the background, and it is soft, it is blurry, but let's just use for illustration purposes how we can make that even a little bit softer, which comes in very handy for human portraits as well, or any sort of wildlife or action. So right now I'm using these wildlife shots just because they're convenient and I think they're cute. So let's go to the background option, and we'll just double click on that and get it active. Now you can see it's detecting the background. If you come down below here, you can see this bottom near Carla's feet, it's saying it's detecting the background. And it's done an excellent job of that. You can tell because everything's red. So when this color shift here goes red, that's the area that's going to be altered. Now that's great, but sometimes what it'll do is it'll go overlap over your subject, and you may not want some of these parts to be changed. So there is a quick option with that, and that is you go into the subtract mode. So here you got your mask tool, it's the background area. If you go into subtract, you can click onto a brush, you develop the size of the brush you want, it'll come up in the icon there, and you make the brush a little bit smaller. And these areas that are gone red that we would actually prefer to stay clean and sharp, or as consistently sharp as possible with the animal itself. There we go, just do that. And I think there's a little bit just around the fringing here of the ears. So I'll just double check to make sure that they're sharp by removing any red that was there. And now what we're going to do is focus solely on getting those backgrounds done, because I've got all the changes off from Carla. So if we come down in our options list, I don't actually want to change anything in the background regarding color, lights, brightness. That's all fine. That's all already been done with the editing software. What I'll do is, just to illustrate how you know you've made some changes, is if I click on highlights here and just use that slider, you'll see the red will go away. Now the red goes away, but I'm changing the exposure, if you like, on the image. See how I can increase or decrease the highlights there, and it's only doing that to the background. So I just thought I'd illustrate that. I'll take that down a little notch, that's fine, that looks quite nice now. And if we scroll down a little bit, we can go to our little menu here for effects. So you can see the effects menu, and in that effects menu you've got texture, clarity, dehaze, all sorts of other options like sharpness and noise. The three that we're primarily interested in here is texture, clarity, and sharpness. Dehaze I don't like to work with too much in this area, because what happens is it makes everything either really washed out or exceedingly contrasty, and that's neither of those effects as I'm after at the moment. So we'll get that back down to 0, and we'll work on texture, clarity and sharpness, because that's what's going to really affect that background area we were interested in. So let's have a look at now removing some of the texture from the background, and you can see if I slide that 50%, we've had a result. That alone has made a difference. If you go to full 100%, it's definitely made a big result in the background, but it's probably a little excessive. Again, you can go back and you can actually increase the texture, and it's only increasing the texture of the background. I'm going to suggest as a starting point around 50% on all these modifications. And of course you can reduce that down a little bit or up a little bit according to your taste. But we'll start at 50%. I think it's a good illustration point. So let's go to clarity, do the same, about 50%. This is not an exact science, of course, it's all according to your taste and the eye. We'll go down to sharpness and do the same now and get around 50% on that. And then what we've done now is we've dramatically affected the background. So just to illustrate how what we've done is already changed the background, if I go to the other image here, the original image, you can see here how sharper the background is. You can see that transition when it changed. So it's a little bit contrasty and quite sharper in the background area. If I go back to the one we're editing now, you will now see that it's a lot softer in the background, and that's the changes we've made. But there's some things that aren't quite right, and that is that this lattice area here is definitely in her focal plane. It's right against her nose on that focal plane, and now we've softened that, and that doesn't look quite right. And then if we come over the other side here, some of the plants were in her focal plane, and this part of the timber and the bucket, they were also sharp, but now they've been softened, and so it doesn't look quite natural. And this is where we need to make a slight change. So what we can do is go into the little subtract menu here, and we can subtract using a brush, and you can choose whatever you like, but I'm choosing the brush. I like the way that works. Choose the size of the brush you want. You can make it as big or as small as you like. I'm finding that about a comfortable size. And now what we're going to do is just remove the softening from the things that are in her focal plane. So you notice here I'm just changing that, making that more natural. Now if we come over to the other side, you can see there's a little strip of what is sharp here. So we're going to restore that back to being sharp so it looks natural. And if I just swipe over using this tool over the things that were actually appropriately sharp in her focal plane, all of a sudden now everything looks very natural. So, and what we've done now is restored the sharpness in that focal plane and made it look like it could have very well been done in lens. And that was a very quick transaction. So if I now close down this tool, I can now show you the before and after again. So this is the before. You can see the sharpness in the background and the foreground as well. And now as I go back to our edited file, you can see how things have been softened. And I think that's an interesting look. Is it too far or is it not enough? Well, that's up to your taste and your preference, but it does show that we can change something from what would have looked like, say, f1.8, and we can now change that down to 1.4 or maybe even simulate a 1.2. As far as brightness and that goes, well, obviously you still have your exposure options in your general menu for editing, but we're not interested in that right now. So let's go to our second photo. And our second photo was of a kookaburra, an iconic Australian bird, makes that cackling laugh and is very cute. Kingfisher family, and they're a very strong and very aggressive bird as far as their prey and hunting goes. They're usually quite friendly to humans. And as you can see, I was able to approach this bird very close. It was quite tame, and you can actually feed it by hand. So anyway, in this illustration, what we're doing is I'm just going to illustrate the background. So you've got a beautiful background bokeh there already, because this was shot at maybe f1.8 on an 85mm lens, and I was very close in proximity. I was actually able to fill the frame just with the 85mm lens. And so what I'm able to do now is illustrate again this background. Now I like this photo because it has this timber area which is in the same focal plane as the bird, and that's going to illustrate how you do this editing without botching it up and making a mess of it. So let's go back now to our options menu and we have a look at our little circular masking tool, and we'll activate that again. And now we're looking at not the subject or the sky but the background, because we want to make that bokeh a lot softer. And it's going to detect the background now. So we'll just give it those few seconds to detect the background and everything will go red. There it is. So you can see the bird is perfectly isolated from this, and it is just everything else other than the bird is going to be altered. So what we're going to do now is we're going to scroll down gently, scroll down to our options list, and here we have effects. And again, we're going to be looking at texture, which I'll do 50% roughly, clarity around 50%, and sharpness 50%. Just for illustration purposes, and you can see how much more softer this has got. This has got dramatically softer. But again, we have that problem where now the perch that the bird is landing on has also been softened. So we've got to correct that and bring that back to sharpness so it looks natural. So if we go into our background masking tool and click on subtract, we can now choose a brush, choose the appropriate size that we want. By doing that, you just scroll up gently to your size menu, pick the size you want, and we know that it's this area here of the timber that we'd like to restore. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to subtract the blurriness from this area. And you can go a little over the image. It's not important that you're right in the lines. The idea is simply to restore the rough area that we detracted from. We don't want to get into the background. We don't want to get into this area down here. That's fine, that's soft, but just around the bird area. And now you'll notice that because we didn't soften the bird, there is no effect with this going over the bird. It doesn't touch the bird because it's masked only to everything that was not the bird. So it's very easy to get in and out the joints. You can easily go over the whole creature, and now we're sharpening all that area that we want sharpened back to make the image look like it was naturally done through the lens. So that's the process. It was really that quick and simple. The more you do this, the quicker it gets. I'm sort of talking you through it and illustrating, so it's a bit of time involved, but normally you can do this in a minute or so once you get experienced at it. And of course, the same thing applies to the bird itself, or the human or creature of any sort. So let's say you didn't want to soften the background, you wanted to soften the creature. You can do that simply by going into a new mask now and go on to select subject. And if you selected the subject now, obviously now only the bird is changed instead of the background, and you can do whatever modifications you want to the bird, sharpening, brightening, darkening, etc., and make all those alterations and make it look amazing. But just remember not to go too crazy with it, because it will look very synthetic. So let's illustrate again. What we're going to do is show you the before and after. So this is the after effect of softening the background and getting a little bit more softness, and here is the original. And it's only a minor difference, but it's there, it's present. It's sort of like going from a 1.8 to a 1.4 in softness of the background. And I think that's a great look, and it does it so quickly and simply. Why wouldn't you take advantage of that and save yourself spending an extra $3,000 on a lens to soften the background when you can do it simply and post that quickly? So thank you for your patience with me showing you that. I hope you enjoyed the images and the little illustration I've given you there. So I hope you enjoyed that video, guys. I find that fascinating when you compare to see how little difference there can be between one brand of lens and another. It's almost insignificant, really, isn't it? And so in context of that, even though I have 50mm Nikon lens, and I've owned the 50mm 1.2 previously, and it was a brilliant lens and I loved it, the point is sometimes they're just either too awkward, the focal length isn't something you pull out as much as you'd like to think so. And so when I do portraits, for example, and that's the context I'm talking about, because I do a lot of portrait photography, these are the two lenses that I'll be predominantly using for my portraits, which is the 50 1.4 Sigma, and here the 85 1.4 from Sigma. And of course I'll have the adapters on them. So here, why do I choose these ones and not Nikon variants? Nikon variants are fantastic, make no mistake, I don't dislike them at all. But what I've found very interesting is that these Sigma ones, for value for money, and that's the context here. We're not talking about who's optically the best. Would the 85 1.2 from Nikon be a better lens? Absolutely it's a better lens. I'm sure it's sharper and better. And at 1.2 it's a bit shallower too and brighter. So all these factors are fantastic. However, for $700 I can have this one, which is 95% as good. Otherwise I've got to spend another $3,000 on top of that to get the Nikon f1.2 lens, and it's just not worth it for me. So optically perfect if you zoom into 200% and you're pixel peeping, but look, I don't do that. I don't do that with my photos because that's cruel and ridiculous. And the people you give your photos to, or when you post them online, they don't do that. No one's putting them up at 200% and comparing one lens with the other lens with this aperture. No one does that. That's just something we do as photographers to mess with our own heads. We waste our time. But really, the image looks good and you're happy with the presentation of it and the background bokeh and the sharpness, which I am very much so. I'm going to be using these two simply for value for money's sake. And here's the other factor with it too. The 50 1.2 and then the 85 1.2, or the Plena, if you want to include that into the mix, that's a 35 1.8. These are $4,000 lenses, 4,000 Australian roughly. And see, if I was to drop one, get it broken or stolen when I'm on site, I'm heartbroken. That is devastating loss. Imagine losing all three at once. Someone grabs your camera bag and walks off while your back's turned. You turn around, all three lenses are gone. You've just lost $12,000. That's horrendous amount of money to lose. I can lose these two lenses. I've lost $1,500. I can deal with that. If I lose one, it's $800 or $700. I can deal with that. But when you're losing $12,000, there's your whole year destroyed. So I can't afford to take lenses like that out with me all the time and risk them, especially when I traverse over rocks and rough terrain and hills and mountainsides and so on to get that perfect shot. Got some model and she wants a particular wilderness site. It's a risky business with your equipment. So for me, it's a great idea to have something that's affordable but gives 95% of the quality, and these two Sigma lenses do that for me. And that's why you might think I'm a trader. I'm not using the Nikon gear. What's wrong with me? I must be mad. Was my heart in another place? No, it's nothing like that. It's just my head's in the right place and I'm trying to get the best value and bang for my buck as I can. So yes, I've tried all these lenses. There's almost no Nikon lens I haven't had at one stage or another. I buy them, I use them, I make an evaluation on its value for me, and then I may move on. And that's what I'm constantly doing. And I think the 50mm just proves that I got rid of two Sigma lenses to buy this one Nikon one because I think that's going to be the perfect fit in my niche that I needed to fill. And I'm very happy to do so. So thank you for your patience with this video on 50 and 85mm lenses. I hope you found it very interesting and informative, and I thank you for your time and energy putting up with me. Have a great day, guys. Bye.